Hey guys, welcome back to SLT Learning, and this is Ankit Prajapati, and today we're gonna cover another questions on API testing. And if you are preparing for QA manual or automation engineer job role, I will suggest API is one of the crucial things. You should always learn the API side because in both the interviews they will ask about the API. Either it will be the manual or it could be the automation. Okay, so let's jump to the API side and let's see what questions we're gonna cover today. So what is the API uses and what are the different parameter of it? Okay, so this is one of the crucial things that they're gonna ask you. What is API uses, like how the uses of API will be defined by the API provider. Okay, and uses, that means API provider is limiting the end client of using their APIs, and how and what parameters it will be considered. Let's we understand this part. Okay, so API uses refer to how frequently and in what manner the API is being called by the client from the API provider side. Okay, so let's suppose if I am a API provider and I want to give my client access on certain things, so I can limit them. They can only hit the, like I will just say, they can only make the 100 API call in a 1 minute, or they can only access the product related information. They cannot access the order related information. So those kind of information you can limit in a API uses. Okay, so the key things will be how you can track them, how often API is used, what endpoint are being accessed by that particular API key. If it is not allowed, then it should show the access denied. If it is allowed, then it will show the information. Then which users or app are making the request. This can be also a very crucial things. You need to understand the API from which application and from which user they are trying to fetch the information. Okay, the response time, the response, I will just say is the error rate. Like if your API is giving the more error to them, then what could be the reason, then I need to identify and troubleshoot. So response time, the error rate and all those information, then what kind of the data they should access. Okay, this is one of the crucial point in API uses. So this is how, these are the parameter you can consider, the key things you can consider to track the API uses. Okay, then why track API uses, why it is very much important. Okay, so monitoring and debugging purpose, you need to detect this, you need to see the monitoring. Okay, the API response are fast, slow, or what is, if it is continuously failing, or out of 10 it is only passing for 2 times. So those kind of the error rate you need to also identify. Then overuse the endpoint, if you need to see what is the endpoint you keep frequently keep hitting for the some data, right? So those kind of the information, the monitoring and debugging purpose you can use. Billing, charges customer based API. Like most of the companies nowadays charge the customer based on the API uses. Okay, so suppose if we give you the unlimited access of our API, but the charges will be per hit on the our API call. Okay, so based on that they can track the billing rate for the each and every customer based on the API uses. Then rate limiting and threatening, means prevent the abuse and overuse of API. Means API should be only accessible by the API keys or the over kind of authentication method only. So it will limit the rate of the API hitting the server. Okay, the security, identify suspicious activity or spike in the uses. So this kind of the, if you keep the your API uses track, then you will easily identify the security related bottleneck. Okay, in your API use. Then analytics, understand the client behavior, which API they frequently hit, and they what kind of data they are frequently fetching from the server. So those kind of analytic you can do, and the report you can represent with the management. So that's why we can track the API uses in the API testing. Okay, and what is API uses, so these are the way you can limit the API uses. So let's we understand the different parameters over here. So the first things would be the endpoint, which endpoint you need to call, like whatever they're coming after API, this is called user endpoint, then product endpoint, this kind of things. Then methods, which are the method are supported for that API uses. So get, post, put, call. Sometimes they we only allowed get, or we only allowed to delete, or we only allowed to post the request. So this kind of the HTTP method you can I will just limit in the API uses. Then the request count, number of time the API or endpoint is accessed. So request count you can track. And status code, what is a, this is mainly used for to identify the error rate and the failing API. So what is the response code of that particular API coming most of the time. Then client and app ID, to identify, to track the it is coming from the genuine and the valid resource that from the client side. API key and token, use the track of users per user. So if you have provided the API key to your client, you need to make sure they use the API based on the limit or based on the rate you have decided for them. Okay. Response time is to just check the performance of the API. Then error rate, percentage of the failed request, like for access or 5 access means client side error code or server side response code will be getting on the API side. Then the request payload, you need to also understand the size of the payload that they pass on the post and put call most of the times where the request body is involved. Then the timestamp when the API was accessed. Then the rate limits, threshold, the set number of calls per unit or per minute, like 100,000 call per hours for that specific API. So that rate limit you can also say set up. Then geo and IP information, like you should only access the API from the limited IP addresses or from the specific geolocations. So you need to track that information. The latency, the delay between the request and response, this is useful for the performance side of API side. Then caught uses, track how close the client is to their allocated code. So caught uses mainly, let's suppose if I have allocated you the 1,000 hit per hour, right, with the budget of $20. So that budget you need to also make sure, and that code you need to also make sure. So for that one you can track in API uses the code uses. Okay. So these are the different parameters. If you just speak about 6 to 7 parameters with their description, it's more than enough for you to answer these API uses related steps in your API interview questions. Okay guys, so keep learning and happy watching this video. If your colleague or your team member is preparing for the QA automation job role, I will suggest just ask him to go through this playlist. It's more than enough for him to understand the description and the syntax and the key information about each and every most frequently asked questions in the API.